Welcome back, class. We're on our last segment in this chapter. We're going to talk about the Vroom, and I think again it's pronounced Jago approach. And this is an approach that I'm not sure, at least in my experience, I'm not too sure how beneficial this approach would ever be from my perspective, simply because most of my leadership opportunities have been in a fast-paced, crisis-oriented, crunch time, highly, I guess, financial-based type of functional areas. So a lot of times I just haven't had the opportunity to spend on this decision tree process, but still going to go through it. And I think it's got some really good concepts in it. It's just a matter of, again, I keep harping on the time horizon. That seems to be the thing that has driven a lot of my leadership decisions. But this particular approach, they talk about the significance of the problem. And to me, the significance of the problem, it's more along the lines of, did it come from the CEO, CFO, COO, somebody in senior management? Is it the information you need to provide to the individuals, trying to apply for a multi-million-dollar grant? What's the return on investment that's up, that's at stake, depending on what information you provide? What's the impact of a decision or the information you provide to the decision makers of the company as it impacts the clients or the customers that the company services? So I think significance of the problem, it's extremely important. I think the leadership expertise, some leaders, even though they lack the expertise, they're not going to let anybody know. But, from my perspective, and I've managed a lot of individuals in medical informatics, medical economics, analytical type roles, I'll be the first to admit I'm not a programmer. Never have been, don't particularly ever want to be a programmer. That's just not something I'm interested in. I can manage a team that does a good job programming. I know how to read the code, and I know how to point out deficiencies in code. But to sit down and spend hours and hours writing, computer code, that's just not my skill, not my cup of tea. I can remember going back to graduate school at Ohio State, and it'd been a few years since I'd worked in academia, and went back to where on PhD, and it was going to be in finance and economics, and they said it's been a while since you've been in an accounting class. And I had to go back and take accounting 101 and 102 at Ohio State. And I can remember taking those two classes and thinking, man, if I've got to take any more accounting classes, you just put me out of my misery, because it was just, to me, it was just too structured, too mundane, just not enough challenge for me. It just did not fit my personality. And again, if I'd been put in a situation where I was having to manage accountants, I don't know whether I could have done it. It's just not my personality. Commitment of the followers, to me, I've always been able to get a pretty fair read on the commitment of my followers. Then it's at the end of the day, your ability to read and the ability to understand the commitment of your followers are going to go a long way from a leader perspective and how you make your decision, because it's going to drive the end results of those decisions. And lastly, it's the followers' ability to work as a team. And again, I've always had, it's a leader's perception, and I've always had the ability to perceive, who's going to be able to work as a team and who isn't going to be able to work as a team. And the situation in this particular approach, the situational questions, there are 7 of them. And as they go through the decision trees, you can see, you can skip some of the questions, or maybe some of them may not be as important as others. But the first question is, how important is the decision? And then the implication, the importance will determine the remaining questions. So if it's a project or a decision that's not very important, heck, maybe you just delegate it off and you don't worry about it and you move on. What's a follower commitment to carrying out the decision? If the implementation requires follower commitment, then involvement in the decision making is required. And that is absolutely true. If you're going to expect those followers to help implement this particular strategy, decision, whatever the vision is, you need some buy-in. And buy-in is going to you got to give up some, to me, from my perspective, you got to give up some control and bring them into the loop and have them working as a team as you develop these decisions. The level of leader expertise and information, if minimal, that involve followers in the decision-making process. To me, if it's minimal, you need to delegate it at that point. You need to bring in some followers that have the expertise that can drive the decision-making process at that point. If the leader makes decision alone, well, the followers accept. Depends on the context and the history of the leader style. Some leaders like to make all the decisions. I've always been more along the lines of, if in any way possible, I'm going to bring individuals into that decision-making process because I want to hear their expertise. I want to hear their comments. I want them to poke holes in the decisions we make. Plus, it gives me the opportunity to help mentor and motivate them to become leaders and help them climb that corporate ladder. I've always said, and I mentioned in one of the earlier chapters, I always want to hire individuals that are smarter than I am, because that's how you build out a good team. The question number 5, are followers supportive of organizational goals? If they have low support, they're, minimum involvement. If they're not going to support the organizational goals, maybe there's or especially departmental goals. If there's not going to support your departmental goals, maybe there's another department they'd rather work for. If they don't support your organizational goals, maybe there's another company they want to work for. Because if they don't support departmental organizational goals, I'm not sure I want them in the decision-making process. Followers' level of expertise and information. If they have the expertise and it's extensive, then definitely include them. Even if they may not have extensive expertise, they can still have some great ideas. And if you go back to, don't remember what chapter it was, but when we talked about Steady Eddie and Reckless Erica, I always loved having these reckless Ericas in kind of the decision-making process, because some people thought that they would derail the decision-making process. But I always like the reckless Ericas in there because they are going to challenge your decisions. They're going to point out what could be potential holes in that decision-making process. And while some of their ideas are really wild and just, completely out there, sometimes you can actually glean some information that's going to help you develop a stronger strategy or make that decision a tighter decision-making process. And then lastly, can followers work together? And that's where it gets a little dicey, because if they can't work together, you may not want them as highly involved in the team. And as they go down through their approach, and then they're providing in the text information about this specific approach, they point out questions can be skipped. It's a time-sensitive model. If you don't, have the time to go through question after question and go through the decision tree, again, you get that call at 8 o'clock on Friday night that says, I got to have this done by 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Do you think I've got time, or do you think you're going to have time to go through that decision-making process? Absolutely not. The follower develop model, and it's important, the impact of the time frame. I think this model is a good model if you're trying to develop followers to become greater leaders. I think this is an excellent model if you're teaching them how to develop them into greater leaders. And I think the follower develop model, it's facilitative and delegative, and again, a great model. But when it comes to crunch time and crisis time, you as a leader, from my perspective, have better have in your back pocket a list of your followers that you can reach out and touch even on a weekend and say, hey, I need some help doing this. Can you help me? And they point out some questions with this particular approach. And it says, are the decision trees better than weighing and balancing the 7 questions? I'm not sure that one is any better than the next. And will the leaders work their way through these models? I typically, again, in the decision-making situations and the work environments that I've worked in, probably 75-80% of the work and the decisions that I've had to make with projects and grants and that type things, RFPs, type projects, I don't have time to go through the decision trees. The other 20%, yeah, they're great. And I'll be happy to use these decision trees as I'm trying to help develop potential followers for the future. But 9 times out of 10, I just don't have time. And when we're trying to put situational leadership in perspective, it's practical day-to-day tool for leaders. Communication at the organization level, to me, is key. You've got to have the information. You've got to be willing to share the information with your followers. Flexibility of an organization. How flexible is it? Fortunately, I've worked in most of the organizations over the years, and they've been very flexible. When I worked at United Health Group, it was extremely flexible. They were driven by return on investment and earnings per share and stockholders, and they had to be flexible and creative and being able to move the envelope in that efficient frontier. Trickle down information. Do you have the information that you can trickle down to your team? Newly minted employees have a different view. And I think since about 2015, 2016, I've seen what drives this younger individuals. Or when I say younger, I'm thinking more in terms of maybe not a lot of experience and expertise. So maybe 1 or 2 years out of college or university. I think they're what drives them. I've seen a huge change over the last few years. Limitations to situational leadership. It's really leader flexibility, natural tendencies toward task-oriented directive, or your natural tendencies towards supportive and participative. And I think that you have to be more flexible, and if the more flexible you are, even if you lean more toward one end of the pendulum than the other, or lean more toward one tail of the distribution than the other, the closer you can get into that hybrid area, the closer you can get in kind of to the middle of that distribution. I think the more flexible you're going to be, and the more performance-based and more successful you're going to be in your leadership style. And then there's differences in perception. Leaders' perception on how to proceed, and perception of context and situational factors. Some leaders really struggle with this. They have a hard time getting their arms around, what's the context, what's important and what's not important, and how do I structure the workflow given the context and the work environment and the industry I'm in. Followers' perception and granting process. What do your followers think? Do they think you're, just a complete Looney Tune, or are they willing to provide the respect and support your decisions? And how do you, as a leader, support them? Because again, going back to right at the first of this chapter, we talked about transactions, leaders and followers. Everybody, as long as it is a cohesive team and a highly productive team, everybody's going to benefit from that transaction. And to the extent the leader can share with followers, I think it's going to really evolve the perception, both with leaders and among his followers, his or her followers. And then lastly, they talk about limited scope. And I think the limited scope, where you get into limited scope, is is reactive, short term, status quo, and diversity and ethics and coaching and vision, and can you change the culture? It sometimes I wonder if situational leadership is maybe how effective is it going to be if you're going in and having to change the culture? If a company brings you in to change the culture, and you're going to inherit the team in a department or a division of a company, how are you going to change that culture again based on followers? Is it a union shop or is it non-union shop? Are all your followers exempt or they're non-exempt? Or I think a lot of that is more long-term, and can you get that done in the short term? So I think situational leadership, in perspective, I think it's got a lot of positive potential. It's just how much of that can you as a leader utilize, especially if you've got short-term versus long-term goals. That's going to wrap it up for chapter 5. The next time we get together, we're going to be talking about chapter 6. Talk to everybody soon. Thank you.